The story of Venezuela's economy is not just a national tragedy. It's one of the most important economic warnings of the modern era because it shows how a country blessed with unimaginable natural wealth managed to destroy itself from the inside. To understand how Venezuela's economy ultimately nailed Nicolás Maduro, you first need to understand one shocking fact. Venezuela is sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia's. By all logic, this country should have been one of the richest nations on earth. Instead, it became a textbook example of economic collapse. This is not a story about bad luck, nor is it simply about oil prices or foreign sanctions. This is the story of how economic decisions, when driven by ideology instead of reality, slowly but surely deliver their own verdict. At the beginning of the 2000s, Venezuela was already walking a dangerous path. Under Hugo Chavez, the government began expanding state control over industries, especially oil. While oil prices were high, this model appeared to work. The government spent heavily on social programs, subsidies, and public jobs, creating an illusion of prosperity. But beneath the surface, Venezuela was becoming dangerously dependent on a single resource. More than 90% of export revenues came from oil. Instead of saving money during the boom years, the government spent aggressively, assuming high oil prices would last forever. This was the first major economic mistake, because economies built on one pillar collapse when that pillar cracks. When Nicolás Maduro took power in 2013 after Chavez's death, the situation worsened rapidly. Maduro inherited an economy already weakened by years of mismanagement, but instead of changing course, he doubled down. One of the most destructive policies was strict price controls. The government fixed prices on basic goods like food and medicine, claiming it was to protect the poor. In reality, it destroyed incentives for producers. Companies could no longer cover their costs, so production collapsed, shelves emptied, shortages became normal. When supply disappears but demand remains, black markets emerged in Venezuela. They exploded. At the same time, the government imposed strict currency controls, deciding who could buy US dollars and at what rate. This created multiple exchange rates, opening the door to massive corruption. Political insiders gained access to cheap dollars, resold them at market rates, and became incredibly rich overnight. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens were trapped with a rapidly devaluing bolivar. The currency stopped functioning as a store of value, which is one of the most basic roles of money. Once people lose trust in a currency, they abandon its hand. That's exactly what Venezuelans did. To keep funding its massive spending while oil revenues declined, the government turned to the most dangerous economic weapon, printing money. Instead of fixing structural problems, the central bank flooded the economy with new bolivars. The result was hyperinflation on a historic scale. Prices didn't rise yearly or monthly, they rose daily, sometimes hourly. Salaries became meaningless. People were paid in cash that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Life savings evaporated. This was not inflation caused by war or natural disaster, it was entirely policy-driven. By 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate reached levels rarely seen outside failed states. The bolivar lost so much value that the government had to repeatedly remove zeros from the currency. A symbolic admission of failure at one point, carrying money cost more than the money itself. People weighed cash instead of counting it. This is when the economy truly delivered its verdict. Money no longer worked, markets no longer functioned, and trust was completely gone. The oil industry, Venezuela's lifeline, also collapsed under Maduro. PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, was once one of the most respected energy companies in the world. But political appointments replaced skilled professionals. Investment dried up. Maintenance stopped. Production fell sharply, even while global demand existed. An oil-rich nation couldn't even produce enough fuel for itself. This wasn't due to lack of resources. It was due to lack of competence and accountability. Sanctions are often blamed for Venezuela's collapse, but the timeline matters. The economy was already in free fall before major international sanctions were imposed. Sanctions worsened the crisis, yes, but they did not create it. No. The core problems: currency controls, price controls, money printing, corruption, and dependence on oil were already deeply embedded. Blaming sanctions is convenient, but it ignores years of economic self-destruction. As the economy collapsed, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Malnutrition rose. Crime increased. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. When people vote with their feet, it is the strongest possible verdict against economic leadership. No propaganda can hide empty shelves or unpaid wages. What makes Venezuela's case so important globally is that it disproves a dangerous myth, that natural resources alone can guarantee prosperity. Venezuela had oil, gold, gas, and fertile land, but without sound economic management, none of it mattered. Markets require trust, stability, and incentives. When governments attack these foundations, collapse becomes inevitable. In recent years, Maduro quietly rolled back some controls, allowing limited dollar usage and easing restrictions, not as a reform plan, but as a survival tactic. This unofficial dollarization stabilized prices slightly, but it also exposed inequality. Those with access to dollars survived, those without were left behind. The economy did not recover, it merely stopped bleeding as fast. So when we say the Venezuela economy nailed Maduro, we mean something very specific. The economy exposed every lie, every failed promise, and every shortcut taken. It showed that ideology cannot replace economics, that printing money does not create wealth, and that controlling prices does not create abundance. Venezuela's economy delivered a verdict not in words, but in reality, and reality is always the final judge. This is why Venezuela is not just a country's story, it is a global lesson. Any nation that ignores fiscal discipline, destroys its currency, and punishes production walks the same path. The warning signs are always there, but Venezuela shows what happens when they are ignored for too long. But the story does not end with collapse. Because economic verdicts don't always mean final judgment, they often mark the beginning of a painful aftermath. After years of denial, Venezuela reached a point where survival mattered more than ideology. Quietly, and without public announcements, the government began loosening the very controls it once defended. Dollar transactions, once illegal, became tolerated. Businesses started pricing goods in US dollars, not because of reform, but because the bolivar had completely lost credibility. This unofficial dollarization brought temporary stability, slowing inflation and restoring limited supply to store shelves. But stability is not the same as recovery. What emerged was a deeply unequal economy split in two. A small segment of society, those with access to dollars through remittances, private business, or political connections, could live relatively normal lives. The majority paid in bolivars remained trapped in poverty. Public sector wages stayed painfully low, and pensions became symbolic rather than functional. The government celebrated reduced inflation numbers, but for everyday citizens, the cost of living remained unbearable. This revealed a hard truth. Fixing symptoms without fixing structure only delays the problem. Meanwhile, Venezuela's infrastructure continued to decay. Power outages, water shortages, and failing transportation systems reminded citizens that years of underinvestment cannot be reversed overnight. The oil sector, still crippled by mismanagement and lack of capital, struggled to regain production capacity. Without a reliable energy engine, economic growth remained fragile. Foreign investors stayed away, not because of fear, but because trust once broken takes years to rebuild. Politically, the economic collapse weakened Maduro's legitimacy, but it did not remove him. Instead, the economy forced adaptation rather than accountability. Partial market behavior was allowed, but without legal guarantees, property rights, or transparent institutions. This created a shadow economy functional, yet unstable. Businesses operated cautiously, knowing policies could reverse at any moment. The most lasting damage, however, was human capital loss. Millions of skilled workers, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs had already left the country. Rebuilding an economy without its people is nearly impossible. Even if policies improved tomorrow, Venezuela would still face a generational recovery timeline. Economies can be rebuilt with money, but trust, skills, and confidence take far longer. In the end, Venezuela's future remains undecided. The economy has stopped collapsing, but it has not healed. The verdict delivered in Chapter 1 still stands. Economic reality always wins. The only unanswered question is whether Venezuela will learn from that verdict or repeat it under a different name.